What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with a new daily video. All of the stories therein are new to this channel as well as I can keep track of. So if you guys end up enjoying this video and you guys are enjoying these daily videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. It really helps the video to do well and ensures I can keep making these videos daily for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts you'd like to share in the comments, either about the stories or the video itself, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I may not always be able to respond to them. Either way, I'm gonna let you guys enjoy the next hour or so of true scary stories, and I'll see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. Keep in mind while listening that I'm choosing to remain open-minded because I simply can't think of any explanation for the events that happened. From 2012 to 2013, I did quite a lot of hiking in and around the coastal range in Oregon. I frequently would go out by myself for days at a time and only come into town to restock on food if necessary. It was commonplace for when I was in town to spend the entire day hiking back the 4 hours to where I was camping at dusk. The trail I took was not well traveled and looked more like a deer path than anything. I had actually chosen my campsite specifically for its lack of foot traffic and its serenity, avoiding conventional locations altogether. I only had a cell phone on me during this period of hiking and camping. No bright clothing, no GPS tracking device, or emergency beacon either. Looking back, that probably was not the smartest idea. There were times when I heard and saw things while out in the forest that I didn't recognize by sight or sound, but nothing came close to this incident I had in May 2013. I had just done my usual restock in a small town some 6 miles from where I had decided to camp for the night, and I spent the whole day in town and walking back as usual. By the time I had started to walk back to my camp location though, it was about dusk. Half of the walk I chose to use dirt roads, until veering off onto the deer trail I used earlier in the day. By this time it was now completely dark out, but it was still clear enough that it was possible to see the trail using only the moonlight. I don't tend to listen to headphones or things like that while hiking. I've always thought it wise instead to be able to hear what's around me in the event there was a predator, whether human or animal or whatever. At that moment, I was mentally doing some calculations for the next day's hike, when my mind just stopped mid-track. I hadn't heard anything specifically, and I don't make hardly any sounds when hiking. If I had heard something, I'm sure I would have known, but for some reason, be it a sixth sense or survival instinct, I'm not sure, I was suddenly jolted out of mid-thought. I was now very aware I was not alone on this trail. What was odd to me especially is that even though I had heard nothing whatsoever, light wind and no birds around, I knew acutely that something was right behind me, specifically about 30 yards down the trail hidden away in some bushes. I still to this day have so many unanswered questions about how I could just feel this presence there. Standing really still, I turned around to look down the trail. I didn't see anything, but I could still feel that presence right there. It's honestly really difficult to pin down exactly how to describe what I was feeling, because I haven't felt that way before or since. It was straight up fight or flight, and my logical mind was saying there was nothing out of the ordinary, while all of my senses were telling me I needed to run right now. Again, looking back and remembering this, I have no idea what this was. It's really hard to describe in writing actually. It was like I was being taunted almost, and I felt that. The presence of some animal or some person was down that trail, and for some reason I knew it knew that I knew it was there, even though I couldn't actually see it. That's what still scares me to this day. Somehow, I could just tell that it knew. It was bright enough out for me to see down the trail 30 yards back no problem, but I still couldn't see anything. This was maybe about 30 seconds of looking down there, if that. I was panicking, but I still wasn't sure what to think. I wasn't exactly seeing anything threatening. I turned around and started walking at a quick pace. I mean, what else could I really do? I knew for a fact that if it was a guy out to kill someone, he was probably most likely going to end up killing me on this trail, or in my tent after following me back. At this point, why even run? That was my logical thought. I would say it was not even a minute into the quick trek back when I heard what can only be described as a rushing sound or swooping air, followed by what sounded like a rake sliding across the dirt trail, the former sound happening right after the latter. It happened 4 times, and each time they were getting progressively closer to me. 20 yards back, 15 yards back. Looking back, I don't know how I was able to stay composed in that moment and not soil myself. Somehow, though, I mentally stayed focused on getting back to my tent. I ignored the panic and kept walking quickly, not daring to look back. Whoever or whatever it was followed me for the majority of the next hour. I just kept heading forward, though, and still did not look back. A few minutes from my camp location, that fight or flight feeling gradually but succinctly left, and I crawled into my tent. I couldn't sleep a single wink that entire night. When morning came, I looked around and walked back the way I came in. I did see some tracks, but I don't know exactly what they were. Perhaps a mountain lion or something. I'm just glad I never had to actually deal with it. I used to do a lot of camping and hunting with my dad back in the day. We lived in Michigan, so going up north was a common activity for us. I think the main difference between us and other people who did the same thing was that my dad liked to go way off the beaten path, like really, really deep into the woods. Often he would end up parking the truck somewhere once we couldn't go any further, and we would hike for several miles on carrying all of our gear. The very last time we went camping was definitely the weirdest one. My dad was really excited because he had just gotten a new full-wheel drive. He wanted to see just how far he could push this thing. After a lot of driving and some quite scary I thought I was going to die experiences, we ended up in this really small clearing. It was nearly dark out at this time, so we quickly made up a tent, had some food, and went to bed. When we woke up the next morning and it was bright out, we got a better idea of the clearing. It seemed to have been a common campsite, or at least that was the evidence. There was an area someone had a fire, firewood, and the grass was compressed in other areas too, like someone had walked there for a while. I think there may have also been some trash littered about as well. As we continued to explore this area further, I found what I called a swamp. It was like a bed of water where trees and branches had fallen into and were growing out of. It had a very eerie quality, but more than the atmosphere, I was afraid of hidden snakes. After checking that out, my dad decided we were going to walk even further into the forest. The trees were extremely thick here, and there was no way our truck would be able to get through. We were walking for maybe an hour or so when we came upon a second clearing. Before we even got close, though, we could hear something in the distance. As we approached further, we began to discover the source. The area went immediately from this extremely dense forest into this open area with low grass, and directly in front of us was an old wooden cabin. In front of it there were rusted out cars that seemed to be impossibly placed due to just how dense the trees around were. To the left of us was this huge cliff that seemed to shoot straight down. Coming from the cabin was that noise. As we approached further, we could tell immediately it was a woman screaming. What she was screaming, I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't make it out, but she was obviously raving mad about something. I remember wanting to check out the cliff more, but my dad stopped me very suddenly. He stared like he was trying to figure something out and told me to turn back around immediately. We began sprinting back to the campsite, and when we got there, he immediately had us pack up everything, get back into the truck, and leave right away. I'm not sure what it was he saw that made him react like that, but it was enough to really scare him, which I had never seen before. We were both armed, and my dad had earned various medals in the army for rifle use and sharpshooting. He was an amazing shot, and when he had his gun with him, his bravery seemed endless. I think that's what creeps me out the most about this experience. Whatever this was that scared him, he knew he couldn't protect me or himself from it, even with his gun on him. So, this is not crazy as some things you've perhaps heard on here, but it's a genuine experience that's always had me wondering. I work as a broadcast engineer, and a few years ago I received a phone call at around 9:30 or 10 p.m. from the on-duty ENG that our OTA, over-the-air signal, had gone out. We were off the air on our OTA platform. The call was with several other ENGs, as well as my boss at the time. We had figured out that the problem was our transmitter, and it needed to be corrected manually. My boss asked for someone to volunteer to go with him, and after a few seconds of awkward silence, I offered to go. So our RF transmitter site was located on top of Beacon Mountain in Beacon, New York, which was about an hour plus from our station. At the time, I had never actually been up there, so of course, going in the middle of the night was quite spooky. I met my boss and we drove down together. We got to the mountain a little bit before midnight. The road up to the mountain to the transmitter site was a long, narrow, windy, and steep dirt road, with a lot of big, loose rocks as well. The drive up was scary enough on its own. I can't emphasize enough just how dark this drive was either. It was completely pitch black. A few times while going up, we would see headlights coming towards us, of people out with their off-road Jeeps. This wouldn't be as weird if it weren't in the middle of the night. We also saw 2 different campfires deep off into the woods, which I assumed were groups of locals hanging out and drinking or something. My boss told me that locals tended to hang out near the transmitter site sometimes and should be avoided at all costs. They had a tendency to be very sketchy. It didn't seem too sketchy to me, but what did I know? It was my first time there after all. My boss also told me he never traveled to that mountain without a gun. He said it was more than just the locals. I've seen stuff out here I can't really explain. We get to the top, do our work on the transmitter, and close up everything. We had just started to head back down. As we were going, we were at this particularly steep part of the road where you pretty much have to ride your brake because the car won't stop till the incline levels out a little. All of a sudden, 3 deer sprinted out in front of us, not even looking at our oncoming car. This caused us to swerve since we were already riding the brake. The front of the car smacked against a rock, which stopped our momentum. My boss instantly turned the car off, and once the sound of the engine died, we could hear something big running in the opposite direction away from the road, up the natural slope of the hill. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but whatever it was already out of sight. We could still see branches moving though, and leaves being disturbed by whatever was moving that way. I asked my boss if he thought that was another deer or possibly a bear. He replied to me, "Can't be, bears run on all 4s. Whatever that was ran on 2 legs. And bears don't usually actively hunt deer anyway. Something was definitely chasing them." When we first heard footsteps, I would estimate they were as close as 10 to 15 feet from the car. The thing had started to run away, but now it appeared to be standing over us as there was a natural incline up the mountain. There are a lot of logical explanations for this, like my boss was just trying to scare me, or perhaps it was a local walking or running through the woods. But there are a few things to consider here. Yes, it could have been a person walking alone through the woods, but why would all those deer be running away from them? And why would it be chasing them? Why would they run away from our car and hide to watch us as well? Also, whatever ran away there was out of sight very quickly, within 3 to 4 seconds of starting to run uphill. I imagine a person would have to be in the greatest shape ever to run that quickly up this steep hill, but what do I know? It sounded too big to be a bobcat or mountain lion or coyote, but I'm not too experienced with that sort of thing, so it's entirely possible. My boss is not the kind of guy that would try to scare people. He's a very stern, all-business type of guy. He seemed pretty rattled as well by this and wanted to get out of there ASAP. I ended up going back to that mountain many more times before leaving for a new job, but I never saw or heard anything like that night. I also never went back after sunset though. I no longer work for this company, and the company no longer owns that transmitter site anyway, so likely I'll never have a reason to go back. I don't know of any reported sightings or experiences with anything in that area, but I do know that over the years there have been an abnormal number of car accidents over that road. I assume most of them are due to the poor conditions, but it really makes me think. I was almost killed 6 years ago by a friend, and it kind of dabbles into the paranormal at times. This took years for me to be able to talk about. I'm still dealing with the PTSD associated with this event. So 6 years ago, myself and a male friend who we'll call Sam decided we wanted to go camping. I'd known him for years, and he was one of my best friends. I wasn't weirded out by going camping alone with him because of this. I decided to invite a girlfriend along though too. The more the merrier after all. We decided to go camping at the spot I hadn't been to in a couple of years. I still remembered the basic general description to get there though. We stopped at a gas station outside the last tiny town and asked to make sure we were going the right way. The attendant pointed and said, "Follow the storm." Sure enough, huge black clouds were forming in the direction of our campsite. I mean, this is to date the most terrifying storm cloud I'd ever seen. And what's a story without a crazy storm, am I right? We sit in the car and discuss possibly going home, but being the badasses that we are, we decided to tough it out instead. We all like camping in the rain during storms anyway. So, we start driving onto this dirt road in the middle of nowhere. As we're getting closer to the campsite, I start to feel this horrible feeling. Just horrible. There's no way to really explain it. I just had this indistinct feeling that something bad was going to happen. We eventually decided to turn around because the storm was so bad. The lightning was hitting right outside our car, and it seemed way too dangerous to continue. We started to head back towards town, but the second we leave the forest, boom, no storm. Well, okay. The storm is localized in the area, it seemed. So we'll just go camp somewhere else. About 20 minutes from our town, there's a reservoir with a man-made lake and a few camping spots in various areas. We park there instead, pack up our stuff, and start on the trail that runs around the lake so we could find a spot with a bit more privacy. The spot where we parked our car was right at the opening to the trail, and a couple was camped at a spot right there. We stopped and chatted casually with them. They seemed pretty cool, so we invited them to head our way in about an hour. After we'd set up shop, we'd all play games and drink together. We get to our spot and set up camp, and I randomly get a text message on my phone from another friend. This was weird because cell service was super shoddy out in this area. She was an artist friend of mine whose stars have risen greatly in the last few years. I explained to her where we were. She said, "Great. I've been looking for a really big fire recently. I'm on my way." Kind of an odd statement, but artists are strange people, I guess. She smokes a lot of weed as well, so I don't understand half of what she says half of the time. So let's fast forward time here for the sake of my story. We're having a great time, that other couple comes over, and we're drinking, having a blast. My artist friend shows up with this monstrosity of a statue. She said she made it in her college freshman art class, and it had brought her bad luck for 4 years or something. She wanted to burn it in the fire. I wish to God I had some sort of bad feeling about it or something, but I'm not really one to believe in supernatural weird things. We all laughed and threw it in the fire. Fast forward a couple hours, my artist friend brought her weed out and smoked with my friend Sam for a couple of hours as well. Now, Sam was mixing liquor and weed. Rita and I don't smoke. It started to get dark, and the new couple headed back towards their camp. My artist friend decided to head home since she wasn't planning on spending the night. It was just us original three now. About this time, Sam started to act very weird. We laughed it off as cross-faded, which nearly cost me my life. It started off with him changing his voice. He went from normal tones to very low, dark, and gravelly. He sounded almost like a different person. We thought he was just getting more fucked up. Then it got even worse though. He started to babble nonsense. It started off pretty quietly, but it got more understandable as he went on. He pulled Rita aside and told her he worked for the CIA, had millions of dollars in offshore accounts, and could make any of us disappear in an instant and get away with no issue. Please keep in mind this is one of my absolute best friends, and I never felt the least bit scared around him. We just laughed off these veiled threats. Haha, okay, drunk ass. About this time though, Rita noticed that her hatchet we were using for firewood had suddenly gone missing. We searched everywhere, but it was just way too dark. We gave it up as a lost cause until sunup. Sam was still muttering dark nonsense to himself, sitting on the opposite side of the fire pit. Eventually he passed out. Rita and I stayed up, chuckling about how weird he was acting, and congratulating ourselves on a pretty fun night. About an hour later, we start to feel raindrops. That damn storm we'd driven away to avoid is getting ready to dump all over our heads. Oh well, it's late. We'll get drunky in the tent and go to bed. This is where shit gets real though. We shook him gently until he moaned. We explained that it was starting to rain. Time to go to bed. He struggled up and Rita and I each grabbed a side and hauled him to the tent. We stopped in front of the tent to unzip it. When Sam totally just went nuts. It was out of this world, like he was possessed by the devil himself. I'm not even being dramatic about this. He just randomly started screaming, this horrible high-pitched sound I'll never be able to get out of my nightmares. I was bent over, so I missed the swing that got Rita thrown back. He turned around, quite gracefully I might add, drunken stupor almost totally gone, and kicked out the last coals from the fire. This was happening in a matter of seconds, but time was slowed down for me. I remember every tiny detail. So the fire is out now. The campsite is 100% pitch black. No moon because of those storm clouds above. The next thing I know, Sam is standing next to me. So close I could feel him breathing. Then all of a sudden I'm on the ground. I was hit hard enough for the air to be completely knocked out of me. Not that I'd be able to breathe anyways, because Sam was now sitting on my stomach with his hands wrapped very tightly against my throat. He was strangling me with all of his very significant strength. Sam was one of those super tall muscular types that had those crazy long monkey arms. I was reaching up trying to push him off me, but his arms were so damn long I could barely even touch his chest. I was scraping at his arms and buckling underneath him, trying to get him off of me. I could hear Rita screaming my name, trying to find where I was. At this point, I was starting to black out. It seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably a few minutes tops. Through my quickly fading vision, I could see Rita now punching and fighting Sam, trying her hardest to get him to let go. She was a rugby player, so she's pretty scrappy. I blacked out for a few minutes here, so I only have Rita's version of the story to go on after this. After I went limp, apparently Rita freaked out. I mean, understandably, she thought he had just killed me. She went into overdrive and started kneeing him in the face. After a few hits, that was enough to stun him and make him let go. She pushed him aside and hauled me up, still unconscious. Seriously, go Rita. Dead weight is no easy thing to manage. I guess I was out for a couple of minutes, but when I came to, she was dragging me down the path crying quietly. I came to pretty full force, and I immediately freaked out. Hysterics naturally. Screaming, crying, shaking uncontrollably. Rita was telling me to shush. Sam hadn't followed us apparently, but we certainly didn't want him to start now. I managed to control myself a bit and started carrying my own weight to walk. To add insult to injury, my flip-flops had fallen off during the attack, and now I was walking barefoot on a horribly rocky path. This was not pleasant, and I could feel the cuts forming already. Rita, being the fucking badass she is, took off her sandals and let me have them. Seriously, this girl is better than Jesus. From our campsite to the parking lot was about 15 minutes, probably longer with my recent trauma, but it was still silent behind us. Sam seemed to have been left far behind. When we were close enough to the new couple's camp, which was right next to the parking lot, we started screaming for help. The girl, being reasonably frightened, stayed in the tent, but the guy came out to the path to find out what was wrong. We explained the whole attack an almost dead situation. He pulled out his gun with the intention of walking back to our campsite to confront Sam. Luckily, his girlfriend came out at this point and convinced him that instead of a murder charge, it would be far better to instead get a cell service so we could call 911. We were walking towards their car when we realized there was a camp manager a couple hundred yards away. Perfect. We headed towards that. Knocked on the door, cried hysterically, and explained everything that was going on. A very nice lady got us some water bottles while her husband called the police. They sat us on their couch to wait, and for some reason, I remember seeing there were 5 deadbolts on the door. There was no way Sam was getting through that. A half hour later, about a dozen cops and an ambulance showed up. The cops took our story and headed up to find Sam, asking if he was armed. We said we don't know. We explained the missing hatchet and the knife I had in my purse. They go out armed. Rita and I still loaded into the ambulance. An officer came to the door before it closed and stated that they found Sam. He was still waiting at the campsite. He was also completely naked, bleeding from the minor wounds Rita and I had managed to inflict, holding that hatchet and laughing. The officer said he was mumbling something about being possessed by the devil, still talking total nonsense. The officer asked if he had done any drugs. We said he'd smoked and drank as well. Perhaps the weed could have been laced by something. The rest is fairly dull. My first ever ambulance ride, a very pricey emergency visit, a lot of drugs, and a CT scan to check for internal swelling in my neck. They wanted to keep me overnight, but there was no way that was going to happen. My cat is my therapy animal and he was home. I was going home now, end of story. To add insult to injury, when I got home I realized that because I'd been having roommate troubles, I'd locked my bedroom door with my cat inside, and my keys had been left at the campsite. I could hear him meowing through the door while I just sobbed my eyes out, locked on the other side. I was too loaded up on drugs to go anywhere, so Rita, in a final spur of awesome, went with her mom and went out to get all of my stuff. All of us were at 24 hours of no sleep. So, that's my story. The rest is the obvious stuff. Charges, prosecution, court, a lot of physical and mental anguish. He pled guilty. The judge asked him if he wanted to make a statement, but he didn't. I never got an apology for almost ending my life. Sometimes I guess there's no definite closure. I never believed in bad luck, superstition, possession, or any of that stuff, but I'm 100% positive burning that stupid statue is what caused him to snap that night. He wasn't a dangerous person, and he had never been violent before. That statue brought my artist friend bad luck, and clearly had some bad spirits or something in it that we let go. That's the most detailed account I've ever given about this event. I attend a group therapy program at the eastern edge of Katy Country, on Cape Cod. We've lost several people, either because they just stopped coming or they graduated. My first week there this May, it was a gentleman who was there for about 2 days. Then he just stopped coming altogether. He smoked like a chimney, so every break he'd be out in the smoking area. I sat down and introduced myself. He introduced himself to me as Ralph. Ralph seemed to smoke a butt in just one drag. This impressed me, but at the same time made me wince a bit. As he was lighting up another cigarette, he began to mumble to himself. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking to me about serial killers. Now, I'm on the autism spectrum, and I have just a tad bit of trouble reading people.
Yeah, dude, I'm so done with my girlfriend. I want to kill her, then fuck the ever-living shit out of her body and tell her I won.
At first, I didn't think I could have possibly heard him correctly. I asked if he could repeat what he just said, and he repeated word for word. By this time, other people were now coming out to smoke. Sarah, one of the people in the dual diagnosis group, came over and sat at the table. I think she could tell that in this moment Ralph was becoming unhinged. He dragged her into the conversation too.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go Ted Bundy on my girlfriend. Gonna kill her, then fuck her body. You think that's a good idea, right?
Sarah got wicked angry. Sarah and I immediately got up and went inside, and moments later we reported him. Minutes later, a cruiser and ambulance showed up to haul him off, and we haven't heard from him ever since. This is why I hate the fact that state hospitals in Massachusetts are closing. We get folks like Ralph. Ralph obviously needs help, and I really don't hope we ever cross paths with him again. I also hope the cops informed his girlfriend in the end too. This takes place in Grand Rapids, Michigan. About 18 years ago, when I was 17 or 18 years old, I was living across the state from Grand Rapids. I was a senior in high school, and I had a lot of friends who had recently graduated and gone off to college. One particular weekend, a friend and I decided to take a trip to see some of our old friends from high school and spend the weekend at their house. When we got there, we realized the house was down this weird dead-end street. It was like a normal city neighborhood, but you could turn down this one almost unnoticeable street that looked almost like an alleyway, and there were about 5 to 10 houses down it. They were all in really bad shape. When we got there, it was a really big and old 5-bedroom house. There were a couple people living there. Most of them I was just meeting for the first time. We met and all got along pretty well. We were all having a great time together actually. Then they started telling me though about how weird this street was and how all the neighbors had been living there for a really long time. We started partying and my friend started telling me he loved living in the house. Things were a bit weird though because he was a really curious dude. He said the landlord had told them specifically when they first moved in that he knew they were going to be partying a lot and doing typical young college kid stuff. He told me after the landlord told him he didn't care what they did. The only rule he had in the house, and he was very adamant about this, was to never under any circumstances try to open the doors to the basement. Obviously, this point piqued my interest as well. After a brief discussion, we headed down to see it. It was striking. Now, to set this up visually, the basement was like one of those very old basements where everything is made out of cement. It was super dirty and long, and had big cement support pillars down the middle. There was nothing in it. On the other side of the room were these doors. Big, huge doors, and when I saw them, my heart sank. I could see both doors had about 1,000 nails in them, all over. Some were bent and sticking out. It looked like the wood was cracked, and like someone had been frantically nailing this thing shut as hard as they could. Both of them. We discussed it for a while, and decided not to open those doors. Honestly, I kind of regret it. I still think about it from time to time. I have no idea what was behind them. We've discussed so many possibilities. What, an old unused well? If so, why would they be on both sides of the house? Maybe some old tunnels or catacombs maybe. The house was really old. The ultimate reason my friend didn't want to open those doors in the end is because he was afraid a poltergeist was trapped in or something. I just laughed that off. I don't even think the house is actually still there, but I know they asked the landlord again what was behind those doors. All he would ever say is, "Just promise me you'll never try and open them." How strange. This story is a different kind of scary, but it is still pretty spooky. This happened back when I was in college, when on a complete whim I hopped on the bus and went down to Daytona Beach for spring break. Well, it wasn't a complete whim, I guess. My friend Joey already happened to be down there, and he'd really been bugging me to come down and join him. Joey really didn't work or go to school, but his parents did have a lot of money. Rather than going down to Daytona for spring break for a week, he was there throughout the entire season. He eventually did convince me to come down, when he promised he would bring me back after the week was over. I only had enough money to make the trip one way, if I was going to spend any money there at all. One thing that Joey had left out about our spring break trip is that he had driven his father's motorcycle to get down there. If I wanted to ride back home, it would have to be on the back of his bike. I was not completely comfortable with that arrangement. I did eventually accept it though, because if I spent the rest of my money for a ticket home, I wouldn't be able to have any money for spring break itself. I had a good 5 days or so down there. Then, in order to get back to school on time, Joey would have to take me back home. It would be a 2-day drive, and we would have to get a hotel after the first night. Thankfully, he had his parents' magic credit card and would be paying for everything. We got started relatively early in the day. We went up through Florida and eventually made it into Georgia at around 1 p.m. This is when things started to get a bit ominous. It began to get dark very fast as the most foreboding storm clouds I had ever seen in my life began to roll in. These weren't just black clouds. These were green clouds, which blocked out the entire sky. It was springtime in Georgia, and by 4 p.m., it was pitch black outside. The only positive was that it hadn't started pouring yet. We wanted to try and make it as far as we could before having to get the hotel room. I had never seen such a sight in my entire life. I really don't think I can do it justice just by describing it. The clouds looked like they were being driven with purpose down on us. I got truly afraid when they started spinning around like funnels right above our heads. I didn't really know if this was indicative of a tornado forming or what, but I could imagine it wasn't a positive thing regardless. Eventually, it began to storm and rain hard. If you've never ridden a motorcycle through a thunderstorm, I can't begin to tell you how scary that is. Each drop of rain slapped us on our faces. My body felt like needles was stabbing into my skin. It hurt real bad. I was worried that the force of the wind and rain would blow our motorcycle off the damn road, but Joey didn't appear to be ready to stop anytime soon. I didn't want to appear like a wuss either, but trust me, I was really scared. We saw a sign for a Holiday Inn at the next exit. It was then that Joey yelled back and asked me if I wanted to take that exit and stop there. I was in severe pain from the storm, and I was cold as well. I was frightened, but I thought about the kind of person Joey was. He was very adventurous, as if you hadn't already figured that out. And for some odd reason, I thought he would have more respect for me if I told him to hold out a bit longer. I yelled back to him, "No, let's see how far we can go before we have to stop." Joey laughed and we continued on. I think we went for another hour or so before Joey decided we were going to have to stop right now. It was just too fierce out there. We found an exit with what I believe was a hotel called Quality Inn or something. We checked in and I decided I needed to take a shower first. Joey was fine with that, because he wanted to watch the weather anyways. Joey flipped on the television, and of course there was a weather report on right away. I'll never forget in my entire life what it said. The town just off the exit that Joey had asked me if we wanted to stop at was hit just a half hour earlier by that tornado. One of the buildings shown on the news as being completely destroyed, the Holiday Inn we were both going to stay at. We were shocked. If we had taken that exit just an hour ago and checked into that hotel, we would not be here right now. We would have been there right when that tornado destroyed it. It was really weird, because I wanted so badly to get out of that storm, but for whatever reason, something told me it was not right to exit at that moment. I live in a small town with my family. I was 19 when this happened. My brother was 13 years old. This happened when he was on spring break from school. My parents had already gone to work, and I had a job too, but I didn't have to go in until later in the day. There was going to be a period of about 4 hours or so after I went to work that my brother would be home alone in the house. That wasn't too big a deal to us though. He was already 13 years old. On this day, I had about an hour before it was time for me to leave for work. It was around 11 a.m. I believe. When I woke up, it was raining and storming very hard. It was pretty fierce out there. The wind was strong and blowing the trees back and forth. The sky was completely black with clouds. It looked more like the sun had recently set, rather than recently having risen. The rain was pounding our house too. I was the type who didn't like to get up really long before going to work. I had to be there at 12:30, so I woke up at 11, made myself some coffee, and went into the living room to relax for a while. I was watching a bit of TV, and halfway watching the storm as well, when something outside caught my eye. I looked over, only to see a man out in the middle of the storm, walking down the street. He was tall and dressed in all black, but the weirdest thing was, he didn't seem to have an umbrella or even a raincoat. It was quite strange. I figured maybe he had just been out and about and gotten caught in the storm, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry either. As he walked down the street, he watched our house with a strange look on his face. Then he turned the block. I got a feeling something was wrong here, but I tried not to let it bother me too much. As I was watching the television more, about 10 minutes later, it caught my eye once again. I looked out the window and was quite surprised to see the man wandering around the block once more. Just like the last time, he kept glancing at our house, pivoting his head as he walked along. This time I was much more concerned than I had been before. Before, the man was just a strange weirdo walking around in the rain. Now he was a strange weirdo walking around in the rain who seemed to have something on his mind. And it seemed to have something to do with my home. At first, I could have dismissed this all as him just having been caught out in the storm, but walking around the block multiple times indicated he was in no hurry to get anywhere. Just a strange man walking in the rain. I had finished my coffee and I had to get to work soon, but I decided I needed to wait and see if the man would circle our house yet again. I was really hoping it wasn't something other than just a weirdo who liked the rain. Maybe he really wasn't singling out our home. Perhaps he was casing every house on the block for an empty one. This was the third time he walked around, once again looking at our home specifically. I got really concerned now. It was exactly like before, too. I really wasn't sure what to do in this instance. I didn't think the guy had done anything wrong or illegal, so I couldn't call the police on him, but I didn't feel safe leaving my 13-year-old brother home alone. It was a slim chance, but there was a chance this man was going to try to break in when I left or something. I couldn't take my brother to work with me, so I had to find some other way. When I left, all the cars would be gone from the driveway. That may be exactly what this guy was looking for. After going over it in my head again and again, I decided I was being paranoid enough that I should see if I could drop my brother off at a friend's house. I explained to him that I was worried because something weird was going on here. I asked him if he had anybody who would let him stay until my parents got off work. Thankfully, he did. He called up his friend Dylan, and I dropped him off over there and headed to work myself. I double-checked and made sure everything was locked up tight before I left, too. I was working, and the rain was still coming down violently for hours. We were not very busy because of it. Around 6 p.m., though, I got a call from my mother. Someone truly had broken into our house. I wasn't really surprised, although I did feel like an idiot for not having called the police before. What bothered me the most, though, was not that the house had indeed been broken into. What bothered me is that they didn't steal a single thing, or even touch anything. That told me that the man who broke in wasn't trying to steal our things. When I explained what happened to my parents, they were very happy I hadn't left my little brother in the house alone, because who knows what would have happened to him. This was a story I grew up hearing my mom telling me. I was really young when this happened, and I know for a fact it must have been before I was 5 years old. I have some foggy memories of something happening, especially because my mom at the time didn't want me to freak out. Some context. First, we have a family all over the country. I remember spending so much of my childhood just on road trips from state to state to visit different family members. We knew our ins and outs on traveling. 2, when I was a child, I would randomly hug strangers a lot and tell them I loved them. I was so filled with joy and love it just spilled over onto other people. There was basically only one stranger I never immediately latched onto the second I saw them, and this is that story. My mom was taking me to visit some relatives, while my dad was staying at home to watch my brothers. She had to go house sit and, in general, was a better caretaker of me than my father was. It only made sense that I go with her. We were driving for hours until we finally hit a rest stop and got out to use the restroom. As we did so, we noticed immediately this guy meandering around the parking lot. According to my mom, it looked like he was closely watching everyone who was entering and leaving. The second we got out of the car, he began to observe us too. My mom held my hand tight as we headed to the restroom, but immediately picked up on the fact that I let go of her hand to hold on to her other hand, the side of her away from the man. Looking back, she told me it was clear somewhere in my tiny child brain I must have picked up on some sign of danger or something. I seemed to be avoiding the man as much as I could, and would quicken my pace to the restroom and car as well. I never did that with any other stranger. I never blatantly avoided another adult like that. Anyway, we do our business and head back to the car. The man had gotten back to his car as well, and was now watching us get ready to leave. Only, as we did so, he began to follow us in his own car. My mom immediately realized what was going on and tried to shake him off on the highway. He just wouldn't budge though, and tried to get as close to our car as he could. Apparently, while doing this, a semi-truck driver also on the road noticed how frantic and off she was driving and could see her looking back at his car. He realized what was going on and drove up to her side, kinda made eye contact with her. They were on the same page from then on. Turns out the driver had called up on his radio to other truckers in the area and told them what was going on. A bunch of drivers from different routes came onto the same highway we were traveling on. A few minutes later, they began to block the man's car off, essentially completely trapping him away from my mother and I. She turned onto an exit to get off the highway to another rest stop as the original truck driver followed us. The man still boxed in by the other trucks. He got out and talked to my mom and told her he'd picked up on what was happening. He asked us if we were okay and drove with us to a Burger King. He even got us something to eat. We talked quite a lot, and he followed us back onto the road until eventually we went our separate routes. My friends and I enjoy hiking mountain bike trails in the woods on a mountain nearby our houses. One day they couldn't go outside though, so I brought my younger sister with me instead. I was also going to bring my little brother, but he was going to be a little bit late, since today he was staying at a friend's house. This day was a little bit rainy and was also quite cold. Nobody would be out hiking the trails today. They had never seen what my friends and I had been working on the past couple of months either, so that was the day to show them. Basically, you walk straight down a trail. When it turns 90 degrees, you go to the right just off it, then around a bend. There's an overgrown, abandoned forest road at this area. At the end of this forest road, we had made a small trail that led to the bottom of our MTB trail. My sister and I waited for my little brother to arrive. But then my mom called me, telling me my brother didn't know where to go. I told my sister to go all the way back to wait for him outside the trail in our neighborhood. She never saw him though. He decided since he didn't know where to go despite the clear instructions that he was just going to go back home, which my mom called to inform me. I called my sister to tell her to come back up the trail to meet up with me, telling her very clearly to make sure nobody was following her. This wasn't for our safety, but so nobody would discover these trails me and my friends were building. We wanted it to stay a secret. Something about this time was a bit different though. As my sister began to walk back down the trail, I could see through the forest all the way across the road to where she was on her way up. Then I thought to myself, wait, was she wearing a white jacket before? I realized as this figure got more towards the clearing that this was not my little sister. This was a fully grown man. Nobody should have known about this trail, and even if they did, they would have no reason to come up here. Plus, the rain the past couple of days had made most of the trail muddy, extremely muddy. I started running down the trail, then hid behind a tree so I could call my sister and tell her not to come back. All of a sudden, I heard someone call out to me, "What are you doing?" It was my little sister. She had already made it all the way back up to where I was. I knew what was happening now. This man was following my sister specifically. I was terrified. I could tell my sister was starting to pick up something serious was going on as well. I grabbed her and hid her behind a tree with me. We waited for around 10 minutes, but I didn't see the person anywhere. There was no way to go but up the trail towards us, so unless this person was hiding in the trees off the forest road, they must have turned back. We started to make our way back, as quickly and quietly as possible. I started to get the sense, though, that I was being watched. We made it to our bikes, which were thankfully still there. It seemed the man hadn't tried to steal them. I told my sister to grab her bike, so we could walk through the rest of the trail without the noise of our hub clicking. This way, we could hear everything going on around us. As we got towards the entrance of where the forest was, it was much easier to see the footprints. There was one set of large boot prints, deep on top of my sister's smaller footprints, meaning they were more recent. I confirmed I was 100% not going insane. Once we got out of the forest, we started riding our bikes to the neighborhood, and I made sure to stay back to see we weren't being followed. We made it back home just fine in the end. We told our parents, who were just glad I was out there as well. All I could think about was what if my sister had been alone, or if the man had caught her while he was following her on the trail. What would have happened to her in the end? I don't like to think about it. My name is Leia. I live in the north of France in one of the houses in a family neighborhood. I was 15 years old when this story happened. My parents were separating. My mother was a nurse, so I was often left at home alone. It was November of 2021, I believe. It would get much darker much earlier around that time, so that meant I was home alone in absolute darkness. Around 7 p.m., I heard some knocking at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone to come by though. I was paralyzed in surprise. A few minutes later, the knocking repeated. I looked in the peephole of my door, but I couldn't see anyone there. I thought it must be a prank by children in my neighborhood or something. The knocking stopped just a few moments later, and nothing else happened for 4 more days. It was a Saturday this time. I had invited 2 of my girlfriends to my house, Luis and Satine. That day, my mother was at work. We were watching a movie in my living room when I went to pick up my charger in my room. My 2 friends were alone downstairs when they heard those same knocks as the night before. Their first thought was that my mother was coming home early. They didn't know about that previous incident. They opened the door, only to see no one was there once more. The 3 of us were confused. We didn't know what was going on. Luis reassured us though, telling us surely we were creating this stress in our heads. Maybe it was just a coincidence with that knocking from last night. The rest of the evening went over quite well, and nobody knocked for the rest of that night. That's what I told myself at least, until next Wednesday night. I'd just come back home from the grocery store after buying some pasta. After eating, I went back to my room to finish my homework with my headphones in. I was listening to some music. Suddenly, I began to hear banging against the walls. Naturally, at first, I thought this was my rabbit, getting angry and thumping because he was hungry. After a few blows, though, I could hear things moving around on their own. I took courage with both hands and decided to bravely go down to the living room. In the reflection of the mirror in the hallway, I saw the silhouette of a man tapping on my window with a crowbar. I was petrified. The man still hadn't seen me. He then came to knock on the door, the exact same patterns as the other 2 times with his crowbar. Still grasping all my courage best I could, I grabbed a knife. I quietly walked over to the front door. The man was tapping with his crowbar louder and louder. I shouted through the door, telling him to get fucked, and that I was already on the phone with the police. As soon as he heard that, he ran away, and he didn't come back after. As soon as he left, I really did call the police. I was bluffing when he ran away. After hanging up, I cried. I thought that would have been the last moments of my life. He looked like he was about to try and break the window in. 10 minutes later, a patrol arrived, but they couldn't do anything except patrol regularly around my home. The man was never caught or arrested. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard the noises that day. This was the moment when I was most scared in my entire life, and it changed everything for me. Let me start by saying this is something I've had to go through, and there are still some things about it I don't really understand. I don't talk about this to anyone in my personal life, really. Not because of how painful it is, mind you, but I just don't like people's reactions to it. No matter how well-intentioned the other person is, it tends to alter relationships permanently. And though over the past 21 years, I've learned to talk about what really happened, I'll tell it from my perspective from back then, the way I remember it. I lived with my mom at the time. My parents had been divorced for 3 years, which for a 7-year-old is pretty much your entire life. My mom back then was someone who took extra care with me. She didn't like it when I played in the yard. She didn't like it when I spent a lot of time at our neighbor's house, always personally dropped me off at school, and was waiting for me at the end of the day to take me home. She taught me to lock all 3 locks on our door, and how to see what different cars were parked outside, and which ones were familiar. Of course, stranger danger. She was, I now understand, paranoid. There's lots more things, but I'll just skip all that. One night, we were sitting on the couch watching TV, when a small pickup truck pulled into our driveway. This was really strange. We weren't expecting anyone. Even worse, though, was my mom's reaction. I'd never seen her move so fast. She leapt up from the couch to make sure the door was locked. Then she ran to me, picked me up hard, and carried me to her bedroom and back. She told me to hide underneath the bed. She ran out of the room and closed the door behind her. I heard a man pounding on the front door. Then she started yelling and screaming at him. All of a sudden there was a giant crash. Moments later, the bedroom door flew open and my mom ran inside. There was a big man behind her. I could see the cuffs of his jeans and the toes of his black and brown shoes. My mom was screaming. She tried to turn around and slam the bedroom door shut, but suddenly it pushed open and she was thrown onto the bed right above me. The heels of her bare feet were by my head, hovering just a few inches off the floor, and the man's shoes were in the doorway. There was complete silence for a moment before my mom started to quaver audibly. I heard 2 really loud pops, and nothing moved. The man's feet ran away. I heard his truck start and pull out of the driveway. I waited for my mom to come and get me. Her feet slid down to touch the floor, and the rest of her did too. Her hair was all messy and frizzy. She had her back turned to me, curled with her knees against her chest, and her nightshirt was up in her armpits. I put my hand on her back and was about to ask her if she was okay, when I saw a pool of liquid coming toward me from under her body. I flew away from her, out from under the bed and onto the other side of the room. I was probably screaming at her or something. It seemed like just a few seconds had passed, pressed hard against the wall as I could with my face buried against the baseboard, before I began to hear sirens. It was a big city, so I was used to that noise, but it got louder and louder. Now more feet ran through the front door and into my house. I thought the man had come back. I heard people yelling police, and thought that's what I needed. I needed the police right now. The rest of the night, feet stomping, blankets wrapped around me. I was whisked past my mom so I couldn't see her. I remember really wanting to tell them to help her, but I couldn't find a way to get the words out. It took a long time for me to forgive myself for that. Of course, they were going to help her. They put her into an ambulance while I stood on the front lawn and watched. I followed in a police car behind. Never really got the chance to see her again. They said she died in the ambulance. I saw her at the funeral, of course, but that wasn't really her. The questions answered later don't really help that much, but here they are. My dad had cheated on my mom, and my mom cheated on my dad in revenge. The guy she was with decided to leave his own wife for my mom. My dad left because everything was so messed up. My mom felt really guilty and broke it off with the guy. He was very upset with how she'd ruined his life. She had been worried about him for years after. He found her through a mutual friend, and that was that. The man went back to his apartment after and killed himself too. There was a lot of time with the police. I talked to a lady in a room in front of a camera. My dad came and took me to his house to live with him. It was an extremely confusing time. I realized in that moment there are two English languages, one that kids speak and one that adults speak, and only adults are fluent in both. They would have conversations with me in that foreign tongue, going above my head, then switch to child language and say, "Now tell us what you saw. You're going to live with me now," and stuff like that. That's my scary story. My dad really wasn't all that into kids. I just kinda pulled inside myself and worked on school. I went to college, have a good job, have good friends, all of that. But I've learned not to speak about this. The internet is great for anonymously talking about things. But I'm not sure if this really helps anyone. It's just a sad and scary story. I've spent most of my life only talking about this to therapists. And despite what you might think of seeing it on TV, it's actually really helpful. I remember every moment of that night, every breath, every footstep, every loud noise and whimper, and I always will. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.